Okay. I know, very scary. Okay. So the purpose of this elective, I want to give you kind of some of the background or information that I think is going to serve for solid research on writing positions that deal with the relationship between race and race making and international relations theory. Okay. And this is like, I'll highlight kind of what I think are a couple strategic things about doing this research first, and then I'll go through, we'll like talk through a few cards, familiarize us with some terminology, like talk about that a little bit, potentially in strategic terms too, when we get towards the end. I'll try and reserve some time for questions, okay? So the kind of, one of the major points that I would make strategically about the utility of doing this work. First, this is a growing area of research. So they're like a pretty large, this is not a place that received a ton of attention, for a pretty long time, but in the past, like I'd say 5 years, this has become a burgeoning kind of subfield of critical international relations. Okay, there is a lot written right now on, and a lot being written on the phenomenon of race and international relations. So that coincides with a lot of additional academic attention to phenomenon of settler colonialism, of the process and importance of colonialism for understanding the modern world in general, for writing more global histories of international relations, for taking a more global approach to the concept of the international to begin with, okay? And the kind of debate, like little strategic twist that should be nice here is this is also a way to make arguments about the importance and relevance of race, okay, without reading pessimism, right? Just like, that may seem simplistic, but what I want you to think about a little bit, and maybe for those who were in the pessimism elective this morning, it's like, maybe this isn't something that is as strategically prominent for some of you on the younger side in particular, but how many of you, we'll see if there's enough information to even make a conclusion like this, but I suspect that some of you, if you were to debate an argument about race right now on the AF side of a like more typical policy affirmative on the NATO topic, that you'd be going to a set of cards that are really designed to debate pessimism on the AF. Is that fair? Like, do you feel like you've got a section in your back files that's like, oh yeah, race and IR, but not pessimism? Where would you go for those cards right now? Do you know that they exist?
Yeah, I mean,
okay, maybe there's some stuff there. I can all but guarantee you, okay, that this is because of the way that pessimism has been so prominent in debate for about a decade, okay, many of the debates about race in debate focus a lot on that set of answers. This is not a pessimistic set of scholars. They tend to be more on the side of kind of critical transformation than they are on the side of pessimism, but they make a number of arguments that are similar enough that I can also guarantee you that there are some people who will conflate or mistake the two. And you can, especially given debate's tendency to draw from left-wing authors on radical anti-racism to answer pessimism, they are most likely to, if they read their pessimism answers, read cards that are basically alternative solvency cards for this position. Because many of the cards to answer pessimism are designed to say we need a radical anti-racist politics in the United States. The AF on this topic is not a radical anti-racist project, okay? It is security cooperation with NATO. We're not talking stuff that's super compatible with the way that a lot of people have done. If they are drawing on AF work that they did for the water topic, for CJR, for the past few high school topics, very, very different, okay? So that's a little bit of like, I don't love to talk about debate trickery as a reason for doing research, but just like thinking a little bit strategically about how to make this an argument that is about the centrality of race to understanding international relations, but in debate strategic terms is pretty different from what people are used to debating, I think is a powerful move, okay? So now let's think a little bit about why, in particular, this topic may be so relevant for thinking about race and IR, okay? And that's because basically every AF needs to build in a NATO key argument, right? Like you have to defend some argument for why NATO, what are the advantages or what are the justifications that people have come up with so far for their labs asks for NATO key? Give me a brief summary.
because we're doing a lot of economical finance, so it's similar to because it's like
Okay, so your defense of the plan mechanism is implicitly the like, here's a part of the alliance system that is important. Okay, so alliance system is your NATO key warrant. Yeah. What's the core defense of the US alliance system?
we're saying that like the United States specifically is going to be crucial for something with the life for some of the
Yeah, so sorry, that's very good detail. I mean, like, what's the why? Like, that gets you to NATO is important. Okay, why is NATO good? What's the like core argument that you're going to eventually get to if you're defending NATO? Okay, deterrence of what? China, Russia. Okay, so you're deterring, the focus there is on the adversaries. What's implicit in the notion of deterring the adversaries? Where you to what? Like NATO. Okay, like the liberal international order, right? That whole Brooks lecture, right? Like implicit in all of the deterrence arguments or any of these arguments about deterring adversaries is you're deterring them from making substantial changes or revisions to the existing international system. Yeah? Are we on the same page now? Okay, so if we have criticisms of that international system and of the kind of core principles that are found in the liberal international order from the perspective of race and international relations, we're pretty good to go on likely having some specific link arguments to basically any AF that has an actual answer to some of the common counterpoints, okay? It's a nice like strategic pincer, okay? In order to answer the counterplans that pick out of NATO, you got to read your NATO key advantage. In order to read your NATO key advantage, you're taking on a pretty large, implicitly, you're taking on some of those grand strategic commitments that Brooks was talking through, okay? Like you're not necessarily reading a like LIO impact card, but basically all of your cards about deterrence, about order, about any of that stuff, somewhere deep down in there, it's like, that's really what they're talking about, okay? So one thing to know, and this is the first kind of card that we'll talk through, is that many of the scholars who criticize the absence of thinking about the importance of race in international relations start from the perspective that one of the ways in which that is most important is in the defense of the liberal international order or of American empire. Okay, so let's look at one of our first two cards here. Okay, this is from, so in thinking, you can email me for sites or whatever, but I've included some sites here just for people's purposes. Okay, Robert Vitalis is one of the early, he's like one of the people who, you've noticed that this is from 06. He's one of the people who wrote a couple of the books that were like very influential in starting a lot of this work on race and IR, right? And he's a great person for, if you look in the cited by, like basically anybody who is writing about this at some point is citing Vitalis in some part of what they are writing. Like it just, you're going to get very quickly into the citational network that is anybody writing in this field in IR and substantially about race is going to reference a couple of his books or articles because he got there, not first, but pretty close. Okay, so it's good name to know here. Liberalism, exceptionalism, and racism. Okay, right there at the top. I know this is a little bit kind of reading at you, but part of what I want to do here is like process through some of the terms as well, because I imagine that, you know, some of this is going to feel at least a little bit familiar and intuitive, and other parts probably not. Okay. At least two problems affect the I'm not starting with the underlining for a second. At least two problems affect the understanding of America's experience or practice of empire. One is the problem of exceptionalism, defined as a standard way of viewing or narrating or thinking about the American experience. American exceptionalism assumes the deep structural autonomy of that experience, that American history is unlike and unconnected with all others. What do we mean by structural autonomy there? Try and give a definition, try and connect it. So like, what does it mean to think that the American experience is structurally autonomous? What does autonomous mean? Self-governing, okay, or self-choosing. In this circumstance here, right, then if you think about it as a deep structural kind of self-governing of that experience, not exact translation, but it is free from anything else. That's part of the exceptionalism argument here is like American history, and this is that it's being summarized there, is unlike and unconnected with others. So when analyzing American history or American empire, exceptionalism refers to treating it as totally distinct from any other concept of empire or historical experience of imperialism, okay? You probably have encountered this in some of your like American history classes, okay? Our civic religion likes to narrate our experience as an exceptional society, as in the like, if any of the terms or kind of ideas are shared, it's like, we're doing the good version, okay? Exceptionalism grounds, shapes, and frames all accounts purporting to prove American enterprise to be anything but agents of empires, of America being empire's antithesis, right? Antithesis means what there? What is an antithesis? Opposite, right? So like of America being empire's opposite, right? America, empire, they don't cross paths, okay? About the US acquiring an empire late, or as many political scientists are beginning to claim now, America is an empire, but one that is unique, okay? Almost like, let's start to think a little bit about strategically where some of these arguments about exceptionalism might play in. Where is the AF likely to make an argument? What is the argument? America is an empire, but one that is unique in the annals of world politics. What is that's a pretty fancy tag for what argument? Okay, like certainly some of the ways in which the US plays this like key role that it's the indispensable nation, no other country can substitute for it, right? That's definitely exceptionalist style thinking. What else? Where else does this show up in a lot of our 1AC advantages about NATO key or US key? Where might the AF make the claim, well, even if they win that America is an empire, it's unique or it's different? Okay, so that might be one of the warrants, is that America's kind of, the liberal international order is a democratic one, so it's different from all the others because it is led by the United States, okay? What's the first argument going to be to any critique alternative by a lot of AFs on this topic? Yeah, we'll get to some impact arguments, but just like, what's the argument going to be for supporting the concept? Like if we think about these IR criticisms as related to security, okay, or the concept of security, what's one of the first arguments that's going to be made about the attempt to displace the prominence of security or security thinking in the United States? Okay, so got to deter who? Okay, Russia, China. So where is the AF going to say something like, well, even if they win that America is an empire or that NATO is imperialist, it's unique or it's different? Where's that going to show up? What do these AFs have to say about our adversaries? They're worse. Russia and China fill in. It's worse. Anything that displaces the US and its alliance system means that the adversaries are likely to grow in prominence, okay? That is, if you think about it, this is a bunch of the impact calculus that you are likely to hear from teams on the affirmative is going to take this form. Even if they win that the AF participates in imperialism, the US-led orator is superior to a Chinese or a Russian-led one that would be authoritarian. Like, can we agree that we think we're going to hear that argument a fair amount? Okay, so like this style of piece is set up to answer that style of claim that says, yeah, okay, it's an empire, but like we do it the good way, okay? The second blind spot is with respect to the power and robustness of beliefs about the naturalness of hierarchy to which Americans, but not only Americans, subscribe, okay? Okay? Gender, ethnicity, nationality, even religion has served as grounds for exclusion in American political life, but no identity has mattered more than race in determining and justifying hierarchy, as in racial hierarchy is incredibly important in the development of American politics and American history. Thus, for scholars who founded the discipline of international relations in the US at the turn of the century, the so-called races were fundamental or constitutive units of analysis. Everybody who was just in the pessimism elective, what do we mean by constitutive there? Foundational, right? It has to be, it's built in, it's baked into the pie. To be constitutive, it's like the Constitution, it's there at the beginning. It's the founding principle, okay? So when you see this word, constitutive unit of analysis, that is, in order for international relations as a discipline to exist, okay, races were regarded as fundamental to the understanding of the international order at the founding of the discipline of international relations. That's the claim that's being made here, okay? They treated the terms international relations and interracial relations as synonyms. Critics of hierarchies built on the basis of skin color, facial features, or the alleged inferior and superior abilities of such differently marked bodies coined a new term in the 30s to characterize such practices. They called it racism, a variant on the term first used in the 1910s, racialism. Racism is American exceptionalism's Achilles heel, the great contradiction at the heart of the storybook truth about a country, ... their accounts of a uniquely liberal and benign hegemonic order built by Americans after World War II. What we are setting up here is that the history or the backdrop for understanding and kind of portraying the international order as one that could be American-led and benign is rooted in a deeper set of tendencies and historical arguments about how international relations were understood as interracial relations, okay? If you were to read most contemporary accounts of the liberal international order, you would not see very much about race, okay? Like, you would not see in these cards that it's like, well, the liberal democratic order is anti-racist, okay? But you also wouldn't see any of the arguments about the possible kind of intertwining of racism in a liberal international order. So part of what Vitalis is setting up here is an argument that's like, this is a forgotten element of the history of this set of theories for explaining international order and international change. Okay, are we on the same page so far? Okay. Sorry, since I'm in internet view, my Mac is very grumpy. Okay. Empire and race, or we might now say a bit more critically, race formation or race making, were widely understood as thoroughly intertwined problems by those scholars back at the turn of the 20th century who began to call what they wrote and taught international relations. Okay. Why is the term race formation or race making being used in this first sentence? And when he says a bit more critically, race formation or race thinking, why is he saying it that way? Why doesn't he just say empire and race? Like, why have that parenthetical? Okay, right? That these two processes are intertwined and that they're processes. Like, race isn't a given, it's a construct. And the construct of race is intimately connected to the construct of empire. That's the claim that's being made here. Okay, so we've got the like, America is an empire, it treats itself as exceptional. Well, race and empire, they're being made at the same time. To make an empire is to make race and vice versa, is the claim that's being made here. Okay. They sought practical strategies for better ways of administering, oh, sorry, I skipped over a little bit there, okay. So this is the like foundational scholarship for when they first started calling international relations as a discipline around the turn of the 20th century. They argued the most pressing issues of the day demanded new interdisciplinary forms of knowledge. The men central to founding the field, men is being used consciously here, raising funds for chairs and building departments and programs, understood themselves as focused primarily on accounting for the dynamics of imperialism and nationalism. They sought practical strategies for better ways of administering territories and uplifting backward races, using what were seen as the progressive tools of racial science. New race development and eugenics advocates vied and intersected with practitioners of Rassenpolitik and visionaries who predicted the inevitability of war between the Anglo-Saxons and one or more competing racial alignments. Okay, a lot to unpack here. First, okay, when it refers to better ways of administering territories and uplifting backwards races, what is the turn of the 20th century context in American empire building that relates to administering territories and, quote, uplifting backward races? Why is this set of people who are founding the discipline of international relations interested in colonial administration in the United States? Anybody know? Which colonies? The US doesn't administer any African colonies per se. Not to say that African colonialism is distinct from the United States, but just like I want to be a little bit, there's a fair amount that's being assumed here about your understanding of American history, right? So like part of the reason that we're unpacking it is making sure that we're drawing some of the connections. That's a reasonable connection in the sense that colonialism and, kind of colonialism at the turn of the century, the race for Africa is a common term that's used here, but the US isn't generally regarded as a key participant there. Okay, talk about Manifest Destiny.
Manifest Destiny was the United States sought to educate Native Americans and people to become ready for more high ground for the
Right. Backwards races here fits in the concept of we are going to administer, part of this is territorial expansion to the West. Okay, like the late 19th century, the passage of the Dawes Act, which eliminates communal holdings of native land, right? Progressive administration of native policy that says we are going to, quote, civilize these tribes, make them individual property holders, educate their children in American civic religion, convert them to Christianity. So westward expansion is a key element here. What are the overseas territories that are administered by the US around this time? Not Indonesia, but the Philippines, you're on exactly the right track. Where does the Philippines convert to US administration, or like when and why? Spanish-American War, 1898, right? They're like, remember the Maine? Okay, you may remember it from your American history classes, right? The US begins to directly administer the Philippines as a colonial territory. Same thing with Puerto Rico, right? Cuba, the Cuban Constitution builds in the Clayton Amendment, which guarantees US intervention in the case of certain conditions in Cuba not being met. So the US begins to, exert significant influence over a variety of Caribbean territories, okay? So like part of the thing in chances are that, and this is part of a general reading strategy, like if I'm giving you sites and kind of like trying to unpack some of these things, remember that when you're reading a passage like this, right, it's like, chances are it's pretty easy just debate strategy wise to like, says the word imperialism, like that's what I need to know, right? Like it's bad, got it. Try to, as you are reading some of these things, draw some of these connections so that, for instance, if asked about any of this in the cross-ex or trying to explain historical examples or like, where the hell does this come from? You want to be able to make some of these connections because admittedly, some of that is being assumed here, right? Because this is written for an audience that almost certainly like has a graduate school level education and like familiarity with American history and international relations. So there's a lot that's being built in that might be tough to get. But are we now on the same page on kind of like, this person is making the argument that international relations as a discipline emerged out of a set of problems that were heavily connected to colonial administration. So it's not, and like the image of benign colonial administration applied at the time too, right? But like, well, these people can't govern themselves. The US is the foremost exponent of democracy. If we transform their institutions to look like ours, then they will be more advanced. They will join the ranks of the liberal democracies, okay? What's this reference to an inevitability of a war between the Anglo-Saxons and one or more competing racial alignments? What's that about? What's Anglo-Saxon? Yeah, it's being used in a very specific way here. It isn't actually only whiteness, okay? Or it is a specific subset or definition of whiteness, okay? You've got the Angles and the Saxons, two Germanic tribes that helped colonize England, right? It's like that you're talking about the British territories here. And so some of this is an argument about an Atlantic understanding of whiteness. That is, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, if you've ever heard that term, like the WASP colonization, sort of WASP elites. Yeah, okay, that's white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That's a set of arguments about elites in the US being anti-Catholic, that like the kind of degree of hierarchy and religious exceptionalism is also about spreading not just Christianity, but a specific version of Christianity, right? The US is a Protestant power, just like England. So this Anglo-Saxon concept is trying to get at a historical alignment and racial alignment that uses terminology that we don't use anymore. But this person is trying to make the argument evolves into and is influential on our current understanding of race and empire. Okay. I'm going to skip over a little bit here. Okay. Yeah, like, I mean, you've got the, Protestant and Catholic religious wars that dominate Europe for about like 200, 250 years, right? The wars of the Reformation are heavily influential in the formation of European identity. And so like in a conflict with the Spanish, you're not just talking about like something where religion is totally absent, because Catholicism at the time is regarded by many Protestants as an inherently it's like, it fits that same narration of it's backward, it's ritualistic, it's not a rationalist form of religion, it's one that is irrationalist. Like these are terms or sort of ways of articulating these identities that are not contemporary for, they're not like, they don't show up nearly as much in our contemporary discourse. But for example, if you've ever seen, anybody ever seen that picture of the like very large KKK rally in Washington, DC in the 20s? Yeah, I mean, for one, terrifying. Two, okay, a lot of KKK support built around their anti-Catholicism. Okay, it's like the fear that if you all have ever heard of Kennedy having to run in 60, like there were a number of criticisms like Kennedy's going to answer to the Pope. Catholic president, we can't have that. Kennedy's the first Catholic president in 1960. So like we're talking about an era in which a number of these elements of hierarchy are connected together in ways that may not be intuitive for a contemporary reader. Okay. Political science, historical sociology, international relations, and diplomatic history in the US have inherited and reproduced two analytical problems from the Cold War era, mistakes that have taken professors down a wrong path, although there are also some clues picked up along the way. One problem is the impoverished understanding of comparative empire building in the place of some earlier, more sophisticated analyses of the interrelationships among late 19th century processes of expansion, Jim Crow building, race development theory, and practice. What was once known has been forgotten, and in its place is enshrined a relatively new Cold War idea that America has never had an empire, or else America's version is empire light, right? It is in the elective sheet. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay, I got it. He's got it. Hey, Wyeth.
Hey, sorry, I slept past my alarm. That was my bad.
That's okay. This is being recorded, so you'll be able to see the beginning.
Cool.
Okay, we're talking through some cards on race and American empire.
Nice.
Let me. I think I'm going to be basically narrating them. I think you'll be able to do a combination of hear/see them. So let me know if that's totally not possible. Okay.
Cool.
Okay. So this empire light argument, right? You notice how once again we're getting these like the distinctions on, the post World War II, a Cold War American imperialism is distinct. Okay. The second problem is identified by Toni Morrison in her remarkable Black Matters, the first of her 3 1990 Massey lectures. She analyzed the turn after World War II in the US to ignoring race. She calls it a graceful, even generous liberal gesture. Post-war generations had been conditioned not to notice. Theorizing in American departments and international relations after World War II involved a great deal of recoding. Much of this work is itself a kind of escape from knowledge. The return in the 1960s of an old idea, hegemony, is something from that era that is worth holding on to, however. So we're going to talk here about kind of hegemony and racial division, but you see how it's like that norm against noticing, that Morrison argument, that's one of the ways in which like the AF is likely to say that some of these arguments are, they're either, it's like they're ancient history or they're omission. right? They're not like, no AF is reading the, well, current American empire and alliance system are an outgrowth of racial hierarchy and development in US colonial administration. So our job in making this set of criticisms, have a real role or relevance is to be able to unpack the like historical connection between the ways in which present US imperialism is described as benign or as different, and connect that to the historical phenomenon and its origins in colonial administration, et cetera. Okay. So let's think a little bit about some of those link arguments that are made in the second part. Hegemony is not so much a restrained and episodic form of interventionist politics by the US as it is domination over the institutions that were established after World War II. NATO, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, World Bank, the IMF. The hegemon uses its power specifically in order to secure the cooperation of other states in building and maintaining the political architecture to support an open and integrated liberal world economy. Other states and classes consent because they gain more than token benefits. The hegemon pays a significant share of the cost of rule and acts with restraint rather than predatorily. Okay, this is like, you see how that's the summary of every hedge good card that you're going to see, right? Okay, so where do we get here? Amid the class of ideological anti-communists in the New Left in the 60s, empire and imperialism had been discredited and were not proper words for scholars. Extending the term hegemony made it more legitimate to compare modes of domination among the superpowers. That is, the language of hegemony itself is a way of sanitizing this historical connection to racial hierarchy or empire, right? When you say it's empire, that associates you with the old European colonial powers. When you say it's hegemony, that's the like new empire light version that is benign and involves some degree of consent, okay? So you've already got the kind of like rhetorical criticism of the way in which a lot of evidence in this area positions itself as distinct or as, not connected to empire. You can say historically this arises out of an effort on the part of social sciences in the United States to separate themselves from their past in which they used the terms of race, racial hierarchy, backwards races, etc., right? But now it appears in a new social scientifically legitimate language that disavows those concepts. This person is connecting them back together, okay? Neocolonial race-blind American liberal hegemony, okay? Holding on to the distinction between empire and hegemony makes it easy to see how ascriptive hierarchy is reproduced over time. What's ascriptive hierarchy? What does it mean? What is ascriptive there? I'm helping you with your SAT at the same time that I am helping you with debate. What does it mean to ascribe something? Anybody know? Yeah, like ascriptive or ascribing is it's like description, but it is I attribute it to you, okay? So ascriptive hierarchy is reproduced over time is a way of saying that agents are ascribing particular characteristics to others, okay? So that gets back to that terminology of backwards races and racial hierarchy of those are ascribed characteristics. So for instance, people making the claim that it's like, well, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are, the most advanced of the races. They are the most rational, the least passionate, etc., right? In contrast to those at the bottom of the hierarchy who might be more brutish or barbarian, emotional, like all of the classic kind of ascriptive terms that are used to describe the racial hierarchy in the early 20th century in particular, okay? So, thinking about this, to put it in the simplest terms, a particular set of norms, call it hegemony, applies in relations among a superior caste, right? Caste being group or ascribed group, right? We ascribe the characteristic of caste membership or caste participation of states and another set of norms, call it empire or dominion or dependency, terms used by North American scholars beginning in the 20s, applies in dealings with a subordinate and inferior caste of states. Before World War II, policymakers, intellectuals, and the white working class all defended the international caste system as a natural order among races. Now it is conventional to find international hierarchy defended as a natural order among states rather than races with the same effect. Okay, as in we have moved from the constitutive object of analysis being explicitly named as race to different groups of states and their norms and behaviors being ascribed those same sets of characteristics. There are states that meet the quote standard of civilization and those that do not. Among those that meet the standard of civilization, there is a benign set of international relationships in which there is mutual exchange. For the others, there is subordination or dominance, control, okay? Does anybody know, like, when this evidence uses the language of kind of this international order, the dominion or dependency? Does anybody know where that dependency term shows up in international relations? Well, this is defining that differently, right? But it's like when that's being defined as a relationship of exchange. Okay, that's like Britain gets something from being an ally of the United States. They're not they don't depend. I know you're using it informally, right? It's like they depend on us. Yeah, this is getting at something that's a little bit more specific. Yeah, so for one, dependency theory is like a major theory describing like the terminology of first world and third world actually comes out of or is related to the formulation of dependency theory. This notion that third world or developing countries were dependent upon the industrialized first world and were unable to reach an industrial trajectory because they were being kept down by the first world. So that's one place that it shows up for sure. Well, the liberals made the positive argument on the version of that was like development assistance. Here, it's like a very similar set of mechanisms on we will help you develop a set of institutions and property relationships that set the stage for industrialization and industrial takeoff. The dependency theorists reversed it and said basically like, as long as the first world countries have most of the industry, we will be in a relationship of dependency in the third world. This is the dependency theory argument, and the number of the dependency theorists are themselves Latin American thinkers. Okay, like I'm not going to go into the whole subset, but just like yes, exactly. Okay, they're dependent upon British and American capital. Okay, and British and American capital invests in raw materials in those countries as opposed to industry. Exactly. The United Fruit Corporation, right? Britain builds all the railroads in Argentina and most of the other Latin American, powers in South America. That means that they own them and operate them and are gaining the profits from them for large parts of the 20th century. Another place that dependency shows up, okay? How does US jurisprudence define the indigenous tribes? Anybody know the terminology that gets used? They're domestic dependent nations. Domestic dependent nations, okay? The mandate system, does anybody know about the mandate system? Okay. After World War I, when the Allied powers were dividing up what to do with the old empires, for instance, the Ottoman Empire, they established a set of mandates that would be run by the League of Nations. That is, these are peoples who are incapable of governing themselves. They will be governed by their colonial powers under the legal administration of the League of Nations. So if you look up the mandate system, that's also a set of dependency relationships, okay? So if you think about it, like the point being made here is that before World War II, those terms were explicitly linked to race and racial hierarchy. There was no one like made any bones about just yep, these are backwards people. They cannot administer themselves, okay? After World War II, Morrison reminds us in this card, like Toni Morrison quote there of it is even more common to act as if hierarchy does not exist. That language disappears. It is sanitized in our descriptions of a benign American hegemonic system, okay? The norm against noticing, okay? Consider the exemplary explications of American liberal hegemony by John Eikenberry and his colleagues over the past dozen years. A remarkable aspects of world politics at century's end is the utter dominance of the US. Eikenberry argues that it is particular liberal characteristics of American hegemony that explain its durability. Restrained and penetrated order where states possess an unusual degree of voice in American domestic politics. He contrasts this liberal settlement, the creation of a new order after World War II, with the containment order or settlement with the Soviet Union. What is truly remarkable in this account of world politics is the complete disappearance of what were once known as the inferior races. Thinkers like Mahan, Bryce, and Adams, who Eikenberry describes as the original intellectual sources of American liberal hegemony, were among the country's great racial supremacists. His account rehabilitates, doubtlessly unself-consciously, an ex-Herrenvolk, notice the parenthetical there, master race, that's the translation of that Herrenvolk terminology, democracy's ruling ideas. Rules of liberal hegemony apply to industrialized states only, okay? Theodore Mahan is the single most prominent early American international relations theorist who wrote the definitive work on the role of sea power in world history. Okay, he's basically what is regarded as like the founding father of this vision of a global American Navy. Okay, think about when we were talking about power projection in that Brooks lecture, right? Even though he was like, oh, the aircraft carriers thing, that's a bad strategy. Like they're now too easy to destroy with missiles. That idea of global power projection that rests on a Navy that can, transmit force anywhere across the globe, that goes back to Mahan, okay? Like part of getting into some of the details of this, and I hope it's like, I know it's a lot of like, okay, we're unpacking, it's just like, I want to get at the richness and the depth of the kind of historical debate that you could have about the ways in which we should be very careful or kind of skeptical about the way in which this set of experiences has been sanitized or written out of the account of liberal hegemony. Okay, I want to go ahead and make sure that sorry, one last little bit here, and then we'll move to some kind of like strategic account here / questions. Okay. Eikenberry, who is one of the major kind of hegemony authors, okay, you'll see him and writes one of the cards that people most commonly read in answer to the idea that American hegemony is imperialism. Okay, people, if you go look, there's like a very well-known Eikenberry card that makes this like America is an empire, but it's different style card. Like you will see people read Eikenberry to answer this position. This is exactly why you want a card of this style, even if it is from 2006. Okay. Eikenberry, he says, the US has pursued imperial policies towards weak countries in the periphery, but US relations with Europe, Japan, China, and Russia cannot be described as imperial. The advanced democracies operate within a security community. Read here, NATO, along with the alliance system. So like NATO, the US-Japan alliance, the US-Korea alliance, that's what security community means there. It's like a community that is defined by common security norms, Article 5, okay? That's the foundation for a security community. Attack on one is an attack on all, in which the use of force is unthinkable. They form political order built on bargains, reciprocity, and ad hoc relationships. What is a paradox for Eikenberry? What's the paradox here? What's the paradox for Eikenberry? It's like, what's paradoxical?
That U.S. relations with like Japan is not being as, at least this is what I was thinking. It was like very interesting, like in the public dialogue, and what is really, so it seems like after the World War II, we started replacing imperialism in Germany. It seemed like Japan improved itself, and so it got into the security lines.
Yeah, Japan is one of the core examples of the like transition in international hierarchy of moving from a position of a subordinated state to an ally, right? It's like the opening of Japan, and Perry's expedition is a kind of core example of an imperial expedition that then is like that relationship has changed. The paradox here that's being cited is if the US exists in a relationship of domination with a number of countries on the periphery, okay, how could it be that it engages in these reciprocal relations with a bunch of the competing powers or other great powers? Like that's the paradox that it's like when he says for Eikenberry, it's like Eikenberry considers this a like, whoa, how could it be that you have relations of reciprocity among some and relationships of dependency or domination with others? Okay. What is paradox for Eikenberry is better understood as a constitutive feature. There's that word again, right? Necessary, foundational, required, necessary feature of the contemporary world order. The fact doesn't trouble a generation like the one before sees hierarchy as natural or is else unable or unwilling to see it at all. The more one emphasizes American hegemony's essentially consensual dimensions, the easier it is to see some of the basic and contrasting institutions and norms of empire: invasion, assassination, torture, bribery, and segregation. As in, all of the impact arguments that are being made about the benign features of American hegemony rest upon or are founded in invasion, assassination, torture, bribery, segregation. To get any of the good, you must constitutively have the acts of evil, of racism, of racial hierarchy, okay? I know that's kind of slow unpacking of two very long cards, okay? Like I said, though, this is the citational network that you can get into. Like, you will have, there's, once again, you can email me for some additional sites. Another important author in this area, if you were to use the name Barder, B-A-R-D-E-R, just wrote a book on race war and international relations. I think that's the title. Yeah, race war and international relations. And the like cited by for Vitalis's books and this set of articles, you're gonna have all the cards that you need to build out this larger position, okay? Like I said, since everybody has to build in some version of the like NATO key argument, which is ultimately a liberal international order argument, this is a position that ought to link to basically everybody's explanation of NATO key, okay? And the set of cards being read to answer this, part of the observation that I would make here is that the reason that he's stressing that most people do not write about race in connection to American hegemony or empire, it's like another way to think of that is like, well, there aren't many AF cards, right? What does an AF card responding to this even say? Like, it basically says some version of this Eikenberry argument that's like, no, it's empire, but it's different, right? It's not the strongest claim for the AF, right? Not the best spot to be. And so for the most part, like, this is an area where if you know the history, you'll be in a really good position to be able to explain a bunch of these, like, if all the AF has is it's empire, but it's different, and like it's generally benign, and Russia, China worse, okay? Like those are kind of like, you need to beat like 3 or 4 arguments for this position to be pretty good, okay? It modifies all of the security arguments and international relations critique arguments that you've got in a way that most affirmative cards will not respond to. Like affirmative defenses of, we need to understand the role that security plays in our, international system, the like defenses of securitization, the defenses of international relations theory, fine. Finding a good card on that in relationship to race and the history of racism in the construction of the international order, extremely difficult, okay? So think of this as the modification that you can make to that position, that if you learn it really well, you will be in a spot to explain something that both does not have a lot of cards that your opponent can draw on. Second, that if you know the history well, you're on pretty solid ground on, like, one of the reasons that I wanted to start drawing those connections is to think about this as you are primarily debating them on the, why is this a history that you don't know, right? So like, why is it that in reading these NATO key arguments, you are not taking account of the way in which this is founded in international relations outgrowth from racial thinking? Yeah. Yes, there are many criticisms of democracy building on the part of criticisms of US empire, okay? Like if you were to look up a couple of the primary authors in that area, Nicholas Gilhote, which is G-U-I-L-H-O-T, The Democracy Makers. It's a really good book on that. There's I can't remember the first name, Kurki, K-U-R-K-I, on democracy promotion or democracy assistance. Don't remember the exact name of the book, but another person, if you get into there, you'll be in a good spot. Hobson, H-O-B-S-O-N, like I said, you can email these and I can send them in a like more proper citational form. But yes, you're on the right track on like the set of people who write about this write a lot about democracy, in part because that mandate system and some of the arguments about colonial administration, okay, the ways in which democracy has been defined have generally been in liberal terms. So the criticisms of the way in which liberal property norms and the focus on economic relationships, the economic order at the expense of political input, there are really strong criticisms of liberal democratic norms as truly democratic. Okay. Well, so part of it is that's where you're seeing that this card is from 2006. Is like this is not about the contemporary context with Russia, right? At the time, it's like you're still talking about the kind of post-Yeltsin years where it's like, oh, we're going to collaborate with Russia, like they're becoming a democracy. China, around this time is attempting to gain entrance into the WTO. So there's the notion that it's like they're going to be incorporated into the liberal international order. So like some of this stuff is written in a slightly different context, but the core argument that's being made here doesn't change in the sense that it's like great power status, okay, is the thing that means that you're dealing with a genuine like reciprocal diplomatic relationship, right? As opposed to a relationship of subordination where the relationship is basically one way in terms of like who makes the choices, okay? So, well, like this card, even though in the contemporary context, you might be talking about China and Russia as adversaries as opposed to easily incorporated into the liberal international order, the point stands that really it's an argument about the way in which the great powers regard themselves as playing on the same field, whereas the other states are like, they're doing something that's fundamentally different. They're backwards, they're not advanced, they're not industrial, they're not great. It's like that the relationships there are characterized very differently. Does that make sense? Okay. Questions before lunch? If you want to get up and go to lunch, I will not be offended. I can stick around for like 5 to 7 more minutes, but I know it's people look a little sleepy. I maybe have that soporific effect, hopefully not too much. Yeah.
I just kind of want to understand it. So in the argument we just did is that is it saying that the gem is like created as a way to mask like the past structures of it, basically?
That the language that we use, yes, exactly, is like masking, sanitizing. I'm sorry, I cut you off, but you finished the thought. Just yes, you're totally on the right track, right? That it's like this set of historical connections, okay, is about the way in which like this language doesn't come from nowhere. It serves the purpose of trying to say, well, what we have now is fundamentally different, even though there are many, many shared characteristics. And so if you think of those as shared characteristics, so like actually there is continuity here. So like these arguments are the same across time, as opposed to there's this like radical break after World War II, then you should read the present defenses of benign American hegemony as not that different than the like, we need to pull the Philippines up from their backwards, non-democratic life, okay? It's like, yeah, reading between the lines, that's part of the reason for that Toni Morrison quote. It's like the norm against noticing is like, this language is intended to make sure that you do not see any historical connection to racial hierarchy in both American politics and in American political science. So like, that's part of why this is a disciplinary history, is like the people who founded this discipline had this set of beliefs. And so if you think about this example of like Eikenberry quoting Mahan and others favorably, and it's like, they're white supremacists. Like, how is it that you're quoting so like, oh yeah, well, the investigation of sea power, that all makes sense. But this like stuff about international racial hierarchy, like, that part doesn't count anymore. You know what I mean? Like, you are sort of making I'm not equating John Eikenberry with I don't want to like too firmly entrench this analogy, but when these like really fringe, crazy Republican candidates like quote Hitler or something, it's like, well, like, I don't support all his ideas. I'm just, it's like, he got a lot of people motivated to do stuff, like these just really weird quotes. It's like, well, I'm pretty sure it's not that easy to split Hitler or Nazi ideology into these like tiny little parts that some are good and some are bad, right? Like that's kind of the argument that's being made here. It's just like, if these people are white supremacists and they're important for the foundation of thinking about grand strategy, then what does it mean to say that grand strategy can be sanitized from having any connection to racial hierarchy?
Your elective on this one about the pessimism. Isn't that just like the letter? And that would come out before you said after pessimism.
Yeah. Morrison, I mean, like, yeah.
No.
No.
But then it seems like she, because this is everything minus outer pessimism, it seems like that's sort of.
It's minus the pessimism part, right? Like the norm against noticing, part of what's being countered there is that you become critically informed in a way to then not like, part of what's going on here is that imagine like, I was lucky in high school to have a history department that had a set of people who were very interested in teaching imperialism as part of American history. So like we did an entire unit on Hawaii and the Philippines and like, here's what American colonialism looks like. Most of our history books, I feel like do not like, I don't feel like a core element of your historical education is likely to be the implication of the US in global white supremacy. Do we agree that that's like, I mean, maybe that I could be assuming too much there, but just like, I think that's one of those things that it's like debate brings to the table a lot better than your like AP US history book, right? And that's part of what's going on here is the idea that it's like, instead of the norm against noticing, you would look for and investigate a number of these things and kind of critically interrogate what is presented as this very benign phenomenon.
Because like you said that it's just really important for what do you think the next
I mean, if there's one, maybe this is not a like response to this argument that the AF can make, but one of the things that I think is changing is that, you know, the national conservatives and a number of people on the right now, they, you know, because of the kind of ways in which they are attacking wokeness or like, you know, it's like, it's a new version of the attack on political correctness from the 90s. This idea of like, the appeal is they say the things that people want to say but can't, okay? I don't actually think that the primary threat that we face right now is sanitizing. Like if responding to this position from a very different perspective, not one that the AF can't really say this to too much effect, but like I'm less worried in some ways about people sanitizing their language and a little bit more worried about this kind of in order to like I am proudly fringe or like anti-mainstream, mainstream media brainwashes you, etc. Like I think that if any of you remember, do any of you remember the degree to which Trump liked to quote that anecdote about General John Pershing in the Philippines, by the way, the like American commander in World War I, who then was the kind of also commanding some of the occupying forces in the Philippines, that he would soak the bullets of the American forces in pig's blood because they were, you know, shooting people who were Muslim, and it was an extra insult to them to have that be the case. This is apocryphal, by the way. This did not, like, that didn't actually happen. But Trump doesn't care about apocrypha, right? Like that guy does not give a shit about that. It doesn't have to be true. It just has to be what he wants to say. He loves to quote that. Like he was very in the face on a bunch of this racial hierarchy stuff, and like all the people quoting great replacement theory and like a bunch of stuff that is much more explicitly supremacist in its language and uses the language of racial hierarchy explicitly. I am very worried about that. Yes. But that's pretty different than, like, that's one of the other things that comes through in something like this being written in 2006. If you were to read that recent Bardar book or like some of the other stuff that has come through, I chose these couple cards because they were so clearly about the kind of hegemony, security, community, NATO concept that it's like, that part doesn't matter that they're old. Like what matters there is the like, that's really what's being done here is to justify the kind of set of arguments that the AF needs to make for their advantage. I would hope that that's like, you know, part of the kind of critical interrogation arguments that are being made here is like generally some version of these alternatives are combat the norm against noticing, bring this stuff to the forefront, like engage in, you know, there's a version of it that's essentially a form of consciousness raising, right? That's like people need to know the history in order to even be able to make some of the choices that are available. I think there are different alternatives that are, just about the importance of historical investigation for like, we can't make a decision about any of these things about hegemony unless we understand the way in which they are historically grounded in some concepts that otherwise we find totally unacceptable, right? So you'd be reading a card that's basically like the impact of racial hierarchy must be considered as something that is abhorrent enough that endorsing the benign version of American hegemony is not okay. That's the part that's tough. You're going to be taking on more of the debates about, like, I don't think that this is a position that's super, oh, now I'm really done. I don't think it's a position that is like super compatible with yeah, we can do deterrence, but just like, don't call it, that isn't really where this position is going, right? These people do think that we would need an international order that is genuinely much more equal, as opposed to just uses the language of formal equality. Okay, pack up, let's get to lunch, and hopefully helpful. Feel free to email me with follow-up, and enjoy lab this afternoon.